Welcome to episode 3 of the Astro Witch Podcast with me, your host, Ellie Remo. In this podcast, we talk about all things mystical and astrological. Today, we're going to be talking about the current transits. We have a few that are coming kind of later in next week, so the start of this week will be a little more chill. And then we're going to be hitting Sun in Taurus, Mercury Retrograde in Taurus, so there's a little bit happening there. In this episode, we're also going to be talking about how I use the outer planets and how you can use the outer planets while still respecting traditional astrology and the inner planets. And then we're going to be wrapping it up with a tarot reading for the collective and just see if there are any fun messages that flow through. Thank you so much for continuing to watch and support my podcast. Let's start with the charts. This is April 21st. That's when the transit really starts to vamp up. So as you can see here, around April 21st, and things will be pretty chill until then, or at least it will be kind of a carryover from the last week that we talked about. We are going to still have some of the same things going on. Mars is still in Cancer, sadly. We are still going to have Jupiter and Chiron in Aries. We're still going to have Saturn in Pisces. Those slower planets will not have moved. We also still have Venus in Gemini, everything there, business as usual. But then what we have going on here, the new transits are, we're starting out on this day with a Mercury retrograde in Taurus, the Sun entering Taurus, and we actually start with the Moon there. Truthfully, the first few days, or the first pretty much day until Mercury leaves, until the Moon leaves, this Mercury retrograde might not be that horrendous to start, because the Moon is there to take care of things. The Moon exalts there. But then the Moon's going to leave, and it's going to feel like a sudden drop. So let's talk first about what a Mercury retrograde is. I think a lot of people know what it is, but I also feel like there's an overhyping, over fear of a Mercury retrograde period. When a planet is stationed direct, that means it's kind of functioning as usual. It's usually moving at a pretty fast speed. Sometimes it's slowing down to prepare for a Mercury retrograde, but for the most part, it's functioning as usual. It's quick moving. A Mercury stationing retrograde, or any planet stationing retrograde, is the opposite. It will slow down and eventually it will come to a pause. And that's all it is. And that's why ancient astrologers looked at Mercury retrograde or any other retrograde as not a great thing, but yes, causing a bit of a delay. And every single planet can enter a retrograde station. We've gone through a little time right now in which there were no planet stationed retrograde, and that was really, really nice. But for some reason, Mercury seems to get the most hype. People seem to notice when Mercury stations retrograde, and I think it's mostly because people talk about it a lot, and now I'm talking about it. But the first thing that I want to say when I talk about it is, don't freak out. Because Mercury retrograde is one of the most frequent planets that stations retrograde, and you've been through them all before. The other thing is, not every planetary transit is going to impact everyone. It does impact everyone in the collective on a slight scale, but I'm sure you've had times where it felt like the Mercury retrograde was hitting harder, or times where you felt like a planet coming into a house was hitting harder. And that's because there are different techniques that show you what is activated in your chart at that point in time. So this Mercury retrograde will be impacting people more so. Yes, always Gemini and Virgo risings. Sorry. At least to a moderate amount. If your ruling planet is going crazy, you're going to feel it. But also anyone who is in a Virgo or Gemini perfection year, because that will activate the planet of Taurus. Now, if you happen to be a Taurus rising, this could also impact you more because this will be in your first house of self. But it won't technically be activated for you, so it could also impact you a little bit less than the people who it's activated for. And lastly, if you happen to have Taurus activated through zodiacal releasing, which is obviously a little bit more high level, but that would activate the sign of Taurus and make Taurus transits in general hit you a little harder. And that's not always bad. That means the Venus in Taurus would have been great for you too. So that's who this specific retrograde will be hitting. The Mercury retrograde starts on April 21st this month, as you can see. And that's about the same day, maybe a day later than the sun moves into Taurus. And what this means is a pause, slowness, and delay in Taurus matters by the energy of Mercury, right? So what people think of when it comes to Mercury retrograde is they're like, okay, someone from my past is going to come back, one of my exes is going to come bother me, and they tend to think we're going to have big communication issues, and some of that may be the case, but in the house of Taurus, it's going to impact Taurus matters. Taurus doesn't necessarily represent things like exes. It doesn't necessarily represent even communication. And so Mercury being a little wonky could impact those things, but it also could impact different things instead, and I believe that's what it will do. Now, you will also have to look at what house Taurus is in for you. Like if you have Taurus in the 7th house, which would make you a Scorpio rising, then yes, this can impact your love life and bring some exes out of the woodwork. And I will, of course, be doing a Patreon special where I talk about how this is going to impact each rising sign based on where Taurus is and based on how it's going to play along with other planets in that time as well. So, to wrap that up, Mercury retrograde is a pause and a delay. It does not mean that your blessings are blocked. It means they're on hold. And for some people, you won't even be feeling this retrograde at all, or you'll be feeling it to a mild degree. You'll be seeing it in kind of the collective nature of the world or in the people around you. Now, the delay in Taurus matters actually, I believe, will relate to inner self-love more than exes or others in your life, because Taurus is the internal, the receptive facet of Venus. And because of that internal nature, that actually relates more to self-love, more to things that you do for yourself and by yourself than it does necessarily your relationship with others. It could actually impact the way that you receive love. You could feel yourself suddenly blocked from receiving love, from feeling like people are loving you. Taurus also rules things like hard work and money making that comes from hard work and patience. So all of those things could feel very, very tested in this time. You may suddenly feel yourself wanting to work less, wanting to relax, feeling like you went from a time of like feeling really hard work, dedicated, having more than enough energy to put into those things, and then suddenly instead you're like, I want a break, I want a vacation. So yes, this is a good time to take a vacation. Traveling, maybe not, especially if you have this transit going through your 3rd or 9th house, or even like a 2nd house of money where it's like, do you even have the money to travel at this point? But definitely taking a break, slowing down, focusing on yourself and focusing on self-care. And if you feel yourself wanting to work less, listen to that, because the capacity of burning out is very, very real with this transit. And that's the last thing that we want with this or any other transit. Now, the other thing is sometimes retrogrades, I find this happens often for people who might be more comfortable with a Mercury retrograde, more comfortable in the chaos. You may find yourself wanting to change something about your appearance. I'm not saying not to do that. I am saying pause, consider, and even communicate and ask for opinions of friends and people who you trust with your appearance. Don't stop yourself from doing whatever it is that you want to do, but be aware of the money that it takes. Like if you're like, okay, I want to get a hair color, like let's say you want to have pink, purple, green hair as an example, because those are notoriously hard to maintain. You will not only want to think about, can I afford this right now? Taurus is patience, it's fixed, it's long-term energy. So you will also want to think of, can I afford this in the long term? Will I enjoy this in the long term? And there are ways of doing things that aren't so permanent. Or if you're like, I only want to have this hair color for a couple months, so I don't need to worry about long-term maintenance and cost, so I'm just going to do it. And that's totally fine. But my thing is stop and consider. And in fact, any big change that you want to do, especially if it feels revolutionary, which we'll get to in a moment, I want you to stop and consider during this period. It doesn't mean that you can't do it, and in fact, I encourage you to throw the rule book away and do whatever you want to do. But it does mean that you should take a moment and think it through. Now, Taurus actually also relates to like the selling of homes and properties. That was a traditional element of Taurus. And so if you're trying to rent, even like things like staying in a hotel, if you're going through home loans right now, prepare for delays around those things. I know this is quite specific and niche, and not everyone will be in that facet of their life, but I'm sharing this message for those who are. Because you may suddenly be seeing a big delay around those matters. Like you may be in the process of like you're just about to sign that home loan, and suddenly that person is just silent or not as available, or responding super slow. And it doesn't mean that it's not going to come together, but it means during this retrograde period, which is impacting communication and homes, you have to be aware of that. Likewise, if you're out there like applying for apartments, be patient and maybe don't expect to hear from things right now. And you might, but that's the thing. When you don't expect it, then you can be pleasantly surprised when it does happen. Versus if you are expecting it and it doesn't happen, you become disappointed. So do understand that when it comes to communication around the home, there may be a delay. And that isn't even necessarily like when it comes to home loans and such only. This could be if you're living with someone, you're experiencing some kind of frustration, specifically around the money, right? This is going to be around the way that money flows. Like if you ask your roommate, like, hey, don't forget to send me $100 for the light bill this month, and they don't do it and they're late, definitely follow up. You know, communication's key, but also recognize like that is kind of in the air in this time as well. And what about for people who it's not activated for? If you don't have Mercury or Taurus activated in some way, this can still impact you, just not on a large scale. On the bright side, Mercury doesn't hate being in Taurus. So that's something. Like if we have a Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius or Pisces, that's always going to be harder because then we already have an unhappy Mercury. Now, if you happen to have natal Taurus placements, even though that would not be like super activated for you, this Mercury will be playing around with those placements and it can impact you in a specific way. Like let's say you're natal Taurus Venus, wonderful placement. I might even rule the best placement for Venus because it is an internal sign, which Venus loves being in. Even a little, 1% better than Venus in Libra. But anyway, let's say you have Venus in Taurus. This Mercury will actually be playing around with your relationships. Yes, your external relationships. It could be blocking the way that you receive love, give love, and yes, be creating miscommunication. Let's say that you have a natal Taurus sun. Happy upcoming birthday if you do. This Mercury placement will be playing around with that by kind of mental fog, making your wisdom a little bit lower, making you doubt yourself, lowering your confidence, stopping you between yourself and what you wish to grow in this lifetime, and making you feel a little disconnected from your soul. And you get the picture. So if you have natal Taurus placements, do pay attention to the way Mercury could be playing them, delaying them, frustrating them while it's going like backwards. Like it's almost interesting to think about if you have natal Taurus placements is those natal placements are going on a walk with Mercury, and suddenly their friend Mercury just turns around and starts running away, and as it runs away it like pokes and punches the others and knocks them down accidentally. It's like, thanks man. It's a little frustrating to those other planets that are just going about their business, right? So it is what it is. And especially for those of you who have natal Mercury and Taurus, yes, this is pretty much activated for you, and you will be seeing all of the mental fog, all of the miscommunication that can come from that Mercury. And remember, even if it's not activated, you may still feel this, just not on a larger scale. And I think one important thing to look at when it comes to planetary activations is the recognition that we don't always feel the activations through ourselves. Like if you have a loved one, a friend, a colleague who this is activated for, even if it's not activated for you, even if your communication is crystal clear and you're feeling happy with your money and you still have a good amount of energy to work, you're going to see the people around you not. And think of how that could impact you. Like think of if you have a colleague who this is activated for and suddenly they don't want to work at all, and who's left picking up the slack? You. And then you have to communicate with this person who has bad communication, say, hey, can you work please? And maybe their communication is blocked and they're going to snap at you, and then that's impacting you. So sometimes the way that these activations impact us aren't even in a direct way. It's more so like the people around us who happen to have it activated can impact us. Like maybe someone has it activated in one of the places that makes travel difficult, and you're on a flight with them and your flight is delayed, not because it's activated for you, but because it's activated for, say, 5 more people who are on that flight. So this is why astrology is meant to be a collective thing as well. Like we can use it to understand ourselves on a very personal level, but it is also very much collective. And it impacts everyone. And the way that it impacts everyone on a larger scale is sometimes how it impacts us on a personal scale. Now, when this is first happening, the moon is there, it's exalted, and so it's taking care of the house of Taurus. And Mercury is going to be conjunct with it pretty loosely. On one hand, that means Mercury is going to be more taken care of for that day or so, which is helpful. But on the other hand, anything conjunct with the moon impacts more on a day-to-day basis. So there is capacity that in that first day you're really feeling it and you're seeing it around you and you're frustrated because it's impacting you on a day-to-day basis. Luckily, the moon will be moving, both luckily and unluckily, and it will be joining Venus, which I do think is really lovely. I'm excited for the moon to join Venus for a couple of days, because that's kind of like, you might get support even if you're frustrated with the retrograde. You might be able to kind of calm down and support yourself. You might be able to go into hermit mode. It's just these two lovely internal energies meeting up and creating love in the mental space. So it's almost this energy of, even though things are frustrating and I'm frustrated, it's all working out for me, and I do get to take a little break and kind of go within, and my mind is still supporting me. It's almost like a positive mindset even through difficulty. And the sun has entered Taurus, or if you're watching this before the 21st, will enter Taurus shortly. That is the beginning of Taurus season. Now here's the thing though, the sun will no longer be exalted, and the sun will no longer be with Jupiter. So with Venus gone from Taurus as well, it does feel like you're falling down a little bit. And none of these placements are negative, like none of these are detriment or fallen, but it's still going from such a high place that going down to average or mediocre feels like a little bit of a crash. So that's what's going on there. If you do feel like this Mercury retrograde hits you harder and you're blaming it on the retrograde, I want you to stop and pause and consider if it's actually all of these other planets going from a exalted or domicile, like happy place, into an okay place. And when you're living life and you're in like an average okay state, that feels fine. But when you're living life and then suddenly you go from a great place to average suddenly doesn't feel as good. Let me try and think of a life example. It's like if you're used to sleeping on lovely, soft, silken sheets, and then you stay over at a friend's house and they have like kind of scratchy sheets, and they're not terrible. They still gave you blankets, but it's just like, it's not like home. It's not like when I stayed at a really expensive, rich, fancy friend's house and I was totally taken care of. Like, it's okay and I'm going to survive, but man, do I miss that bliss. With the sun coming into Taurus, it is a reminder that the slowness of Mercury retrograde and the frustration of Mercury retrograde can actually bring more wisdom. So I do think to some degree having the sun there with Mercury, a little less when they get close and the sun gobbles up Mercury's energy, But especially in the beginning where it's still in the sun's energy, but just by like 1 degree, so it's not that strong. But it's going to allow us to learn through this retrograde, which many retrogrades are, because the sun is very often close to Mercury. So I think this is even a reminder about every Mercury retrograde that we experience, that they are always there to teach us something, right? But especially right now with the sun and Mercury moving closer and closer, and with it being in Taurus, it's a reminder that sometimes things slow down, not to torture us, not in a bad way, but because we are learning a lesson of patience. So one great thing to ask yourself to make this all more constructive is, how can I learn with the energy of patience right now? What is the energy of patience teaching me? All in all, the sun's presence here is a reminder that the slowness of the Mercury retrograde can actually bring us more wisdom, and of just how much we can learn through it. This week reminds us of the wisdom that is patience and waiting and retracing our steps, because that's what a retrograde is. That's what the shadow period represents. The Mercury retrograde shadow period, both before and after. The before is the degrees that Mercury is going to retrace as it begins going backwards. And the after is the degrees Mercury goes through to catch up to where it was. So that's why there are 2 weeks before and after. And people sometimes say like, oh my gosh, I feel the before so much more. And I used to say that too. But I don't actually think that's the case for anyone. And it's not to say that you don't feel the before, but the truth is, what you've experienced over the last 2 weeks leading up to Mercury retrograde is a taste of what you will experience during Mercury retrograde. It's not that you feel it more, it's that you feel it once, and then you get to retrace it. And if you learn those lessons of like whatever it is that you need to be patient about while Mercury is going through those degrees, then you don't have to relearn them when Mercury stations retrograde. And this is also great because if you don't feel the Mercury retrograde shadow period very much, you might not feel the Mercury retrograde as much, right? Because that would just mean Mercury isn't activated for you right now. So even without looking into all those complicated things like zodiacal releasing and perfection years, you can look into, wait, how were these last 2 weeks for me? Were they great? Were they average? Were they terrible? And that is tending to be a little hint of what to come, because it's the exact steps and degrees that Mercury retrograde went through. It's like, let's say once again you're walking and then you drop something at like 5 feet back. You know that when you walk back those 5 feet, that thing is probably still going to be there. And the shadow period after the Mercury retrograde is over is kind of the reverse. It's like you're catching back up to where you were. So it's like you running after your friends. You kind of start speeding up and you're going to meet them, and you know what to expect because you once again have been through those steps. You've been forward into them, you've been backward into them, you're going forward into them again. And so for me, the after period of a Mercury retrograde station feels, in any retrograde station really, just feels so relieving, because it's like, I know what I'm doing. Like, I know this path. I've cleared out most of the baggage and annoying junk, and I'm just ready to zoom on forward. So pay attention to what's been going on with you for the last 2 weeks. That is a hint of what is to come. Now, during this, at least in the beginning, Mercury will be moving closer to Aries, but not quite going in. So we'll be moving away from it. But at least in the beginning, we do have Uranus conjunct with Mercury. And I'll be talking about this towards the end, but I use 0 to 3, sometimes 0 to 5 degree aspects with Uranus. So it will not be conjunct with Mercury this whole time. It will be co-present with it. So they'll still be in the same house, but it's like sitting right next to someone on a couch versus if they're upstairs and you're downstairs. They're going to impact you less, right? But they might still impact you. If you don't like them, for example, you'll be like, oh my God, their energy. And if you do like them, you're like, oh, my best friend's right upstairs, I can call them down. So that's kind of the difference there of what I consider to be a tight conjunct versus like as it starts loosening and such. And I do use house-based aspects for the traditional signs. It's only when it comes to the outer planets that I need it to be a little closer in order for it to impact anything. So what does Uranus do? Uranus adds a more chaotic energy to this Mercury retrograde, especially in the beginning in those very tight days. Even as that conjunct loosens, and a conjunct is just when two planets are next to each other or in the same house, but even as it loosens, you might even feel a little bit of that chaos. But especially in the beginning, most people talk about a Mercury retrograde and they make it sound really chaotic. And the truth is most Mercury retrogrades are not chaotic. They're just slow. But this Mercury retrograde, because Uranus is fucking around along with it, actually does make it a little chaotic, sadly. So do prepare for a little bit of chaos. Prepare for chaos around your self-care. Prepare for chaos around your communication, relationships, wherever Mercury is impacting you. Prepare for that. Let's break down what each house means, and I'm just going to give you the topics of the house because I will be breaking it down further over on Patreon. But the first house is the house of self. The second house is the house of money, specifically money that you need in order to stay alive, not really fun money. The third house is the house of travel, divinity, siblings, and close friends. The fourth house is the house of home and family. The fifth house is the house of children and creativity and sensuality and romance. The sixth house is the house of illness and injuries, short-term illness and injuries. It is a house of feeling trapped and bound. It is a house of enemies, and it is a house of work. The seventh house is a house of relationships, one-on-one partnerships. The eighth house is a house of anxiety, other people's money, and death. The ninth house is the house of divination, astrology, spirituality, learning, and long-term travel. The 10th house is the house of career and reputation. The 11th house is the house of casual friends and hopes and dreams. And the 12th house is the house of long-term illness, mental illness, long-term suffering, and endings. So that's a quick breakdown of how this Mercury retrograde can impact you based on where Taurus is, which of those houses Taurus is in. Use your whole sign chart for this. Taurus should not be split between two houses. And that area of life is where some chaos may be, because with Mercury being that close to Uranus, it activates Uranus. And when the sun comes closer to Uranus, it will activate Uranus as well. And do be careful, but because the chaotic nature of this transit can lead to accidents. So do be careful. This retrograde may be surprising, and that could even be in a good way, but it could also cause things like travel accidents when you're doing self-care. Like imagine trying to wax yourself and burning yourself, like the pain, or like getting a haircut and it's just botched, So this retrograde may be surprising, could be a good thing, could be a frustrating thing. We will also have Pluto squaring up with the sun once the sun moves into Taurus. So the wisdom of the sun may feel chaotic this week, and that's why I do feel like we are learning from chaos. We are learning from needing to be patient and slow down to avoid the chaos, because chaos comes when we're rushing, and people like myself, I'm an Aries stellium, don't like hearing that. If you could slow down, you could actually avoid a lot of the chaos in your life or in your day-to-day, but that is the very real case that's presented. Pluto is basically saying it's time to fuck things up so we can move into a new time, right? Because Pluto is trying to start a revolution, and it's in a new sign. It's now playing along with the sun, but it's arguing with the sun. It's in a square. I call it squaring up because they're fighting. And then the sun is in Taurus, which is saying, no, things are actually really chaotic now. We need to chill and let whatever revolution you're trying to plan come in good time. So it's like the revolution is still happening, but because the sun, which is the leader of the daytime, is basically saying chill out to a tiny, very far away planet like Pluto, it's not going to be coming quickly. So if you're seeing all of the shitty things happening in your government, I know my government is a piece of trash, a revolution is still happening. But there's a need for patience because it's not going to happen overnight, especially not in the season of Taurus. Neptune and the moon are sextile, so there's a little bit of delusional and romanticized energy throughout all of this, interestingly enough, that connection won't last too long because the moon is going to be moving. But especially in those first few days of Mercury retrograde, one thing to keep an eye out for, if you have like, maybe you have a flirtationship with someone, is, am I being a little delusional about this person? Am I reading into their words what they're not actually saying? And if you have like relationships with people, like stopping and actually talking about things, not getting lost in the delusions or emotionality of it all. And that's what's going on this upcoming week. This energy parts of it will kind of wean down, especially coming into next week, but also later into the week, because the planets will be moving away from those outer planets. Like the moon will be moving into Gemini, and it will no longer be playing around with Neptune in the same way. And Mercury will be moving away from Uranus. So this is kind of the starting point. Let's talk now about how to use the outer planets. The outer planets were not used in traditional astrology. And that is because they could not be seen. And we know that they exist now, but I like to use this example because I know a lot of my following are witchy bitches and do tarot readings. So I like to use the example. If I'm doing a tarot reading, I don't just look through the deck and I say, oh, well, I can see the 10 of Cups. I know that the 10 of Cups is in the deck, so that's what this reading is about. Instead, I bring the cards out, I shuffle them out, they come out through fate, and those are what I pay attention to. What I can see is what I pay attention to. I don't just say, oh, well, I got the 3 of Swords here and the 10 of Swords, but because I know the 10 of Cups in the deck, that actually means this is a relationship that lasts long term. I would say, no, head for the hills, this person's going to cheat on you and break your heart, right? And the outer planets are the same. We know that they exist now, but we should naturally be giving them less strength than the inner planets because we can't really see them. So the other thing is they are outside of Saturn. Saturn, the planet of restriction, naturally restricts and protects us from these planets because all 3 of the outer planets are malefic and chaotic. You do not want to be ruled by those planets. We do not need to there's nothing benefic about those planets here. Now, I still use them, and I still think they're super important, especially for generational matters. I just give them less weight because we cannot see them and because of the restriction. The other thing is an entire generation will share a sign. And then every rising sign will share that house. So that planet just isn't personal enough for me to care so much in a natal reading, for example. Like if I'm looking at someone's birth chart, no. And that's also why I don't see it as a ruler, because then every single, like, let's say Aquarius rising who was born within the same generation would have their chart ruler in the same house. Versus when we look at Saturn, which moves pretty frequently every few years, then there's more variety there. So they're definitely not house rulers. They're definitely not sign rulers. I treat them almost similar to the way I treat asteroids, in which they do add some flavor, but they just aren't personal enough that I put so much weight, and I never treat them as a ruler or most important part of a reading. I do think that these planets mean a lot more for collective matters, which is why I use it more like in these little readings than I ever do in my personal readings. And we know how collective matters relate to our personal matters because I discussed that earlier. So they are still important to our personal self, but they're just very collective and generational. Now, if someone, this chart is actually an example of it. If there's like a 0 to 3 degree conjunct, so Mercury and the moon Mercury and Uranus, 2 degrees apart here. One is at 15 degrees in Taurus, one is at 17 degrees in Taurus, 2 degrees apart. That is going to impact Mercury, and so it would impact someone born at this time. I do sometimes go up to 5 degrees. But if I go up to 5 degrees, I obviously consider it to be a looser aspect. And I consider that to be when we start seeing the manifestation of these planets. Which is why I kind of talked about how the sun was playing around with Pluto. I do think close aspects to the moon for those few days are a time in which those aspects are going to be manifesting in a huge way. Because in traditional astrology, any aspect, especially applying aspects to the moon, represents something that happens on a day-to-day basis. So that's why I'm like, ooh, that Neptune is still pretty far from the moon, but at some point it was probably closer, like literally earlier in the day because of how quickly the moon moves. And so I feel like there's something going on there, and I feel like that could activate that Uranus. So that's how I use the outer planets, and I believe a lot of traditional astrologers like myself use it similarly. Now we're going to do a little collective reading. Let's see, just to wrap things up today. I didn't have too much news to talk about. Like, there's no fun celebrity drama that I'm not already covering on TikTok, sadly. And the way I shuffle my tarot, no wrong way to do it, but I do this type of shuffle, which I'm not good at, 3 to 6 times, and then I overhand shuffle until the card kind of falls out or just feels right. Okay, give me 3 cards for the collective messages, please. Okay, and what I want you to do today is we're doing a little pick a card reading. So I want you to kind of focus on the energy around numbers 1, 2, or 3 and figure out which you feel most guided to. I'm going to show you the back of the cards. So for VOD watchers, this is card number 1. If you were feeling most drawn to this card. This is card number 2. And this is card number 3. And the other thing that you can do is just listen to all of them and see which messages resonate, or take them all, or you can take multiple. There's really no rules here. I just wanted to give a little bit of an intuitive game for those of you watching. So if you've picked card number 1, card number 1 is the Knight of Wands. And so that's telling me that this upcoming week is definitely a week of action. So you are one of the people who needs to be very cautious about the possibility of burnout this week. Now, this can be a great thing. You may have a lot of really creative ideas. You may find yourself traveling, but it's just saying, do be cautious. Don't speed up. If you've picked number 1, there's even a chance that you are a very speedy person in general. Maybe you have some fire or Aries placements within you as well. And that's going to be one of the lessons you'll be learning this week, is how to slow down and how to be patient. So be aware of that lesson. And if there are any actions you're wanting to take them. Because the Knight's saying take those actions. But make sure that you're patient. Make sure that you're patient with the people around you. Make sure that you're patient in allowing for responses or reactions to come in due time. And if you're not such a speedy person, then the message for you here is someone may instead be coming to you with a little bit of energy, speeding in your direction, and you can prepare for that as well. If you have picked card number 2, you've picked the 5 of Swords. So this week and these transits may be impacting you in a way that makes you feel very mentally worn down, really kind of exhausted and tired, and you may fight some battles, especially around communication, that make you feel like you, in the bluntest way possible, are a loser. Like, it feels like you're losing something, and I don't think that you are necessarily, but that's the feeling here. So you are one of the people who will be more impacted around the communication of this, and specifically feeling like you just can't communicate right. Like, no matter how you communicate, people just aren't receiving your communication in the proper way. And all of the frustration that comes from that, of feeling misunderstood, of feeling like you're trying your best to speak your truth and it's just not being received properly. So slow down, double check your emails for typos, and prepare for a really traditional manifestation of the Mercury retrograde, in which it does feel like it's all around like the mentality and communication. On the other hand, if you've picked card number 3, you've picked the 5 of Cups, and this is going to be more of an emotional one for you, actually. Maybe it's that moon energy towards the beginning, or maybe Taurus is going through a very emotional house, or you have some like emotional Taurus placements, but this is going to impact your heart and your soul and that inner world and that self-love, and you're going to be feeling kind of low and down and sad more than anything else. So prepare for some harder emotions throughout this. Prepare for yourself to feel like you're losing something. And yes, you might be one of the people who misses your ex. Maybe you don't even hear from them. Maybe they're not even the one reaching out to you. But for whatever reason, you seem to be missing them, longing for them, thinking about them. Or you can feel that they are doing that for you. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be an ex. A Mercury retrograde often brings up exes because it's a time of moving backwards, but it could be someone in your present. Either way, there's a type of loneliness. So my recommendation, and I'm going to actually draw one more card for each pile for advice, but my recommendation is to surround yourself with the people in your present. That's one way to ensure that you never feel lonely, is remembering how many people are on your side and by your side now. Okay, so let's draw one more card for each pile of advice and guidance throughout the week. Okay. Pile number 1, we got the 9 of Pentacles for you. So your like energy this week is very much wanting to move, wanting to take action, wanting to do, wanting to create. But in fact, your guidance is like, slow down. Instead of focusing on putting that energy outward and putting it into everyone else and everything else, put it into yourself. And in fact, you're meant to be focusing a little bit on that Taurus energy of going really slow, experiencing the pleasure of the world and pleasuring yourself. So allow for that to be your focus this upcoming week. And then we have the 8 of Wands for pile number 2. So for 8 of Wands, your message is actually the opposite. Oh, 9 of Wands, that makes all the difference. 9 of Wands. I do feel like you're meant to be hermiting out a little bit with this energy, because for you it's like miscommunications, not getting along with people, feeling like you're losing in some kind of situation. And so it's so interesting, we're getting so many messages of 9s here, but for you it's like, slow down and go into hermit mode, take a rest. You've already burnt yourself out if you picked pile number 2, most likely. And so you are burning fumes at this point. You're operating from a place of not really doing your best, and you're continuing to try and force yourself to do. But in reality, you do need to slow down. So this is your message of, if you feel yourself like at the end of your rope, don't keep burning it. Slow down. And similar message for pile number 3, actually, with the Page of Pentacles. The Page of Pentacles is like, if there's someone who you want to reach out to and connect with in this Mercury retrograde, go for it, but don't rush into it. If that urge comes up, give yourself 2 days, 3 days, feel into it, think over it. Likewise, if you are communicating with someone else and you're waiting to hear back from them, be patient. You may not hear back right away, but that's not to say that you'll never hear back. And that's what we have here for this upcoming week. Thank you so much for joining me in another episode of the Astro Witch. I hope to see you in future episodes as well. And comment below if you enjoyed this.